Would you turn with me, please, to the book of Revelation, chapter 1. While you are turning there, I feel there's a couple of things that I need to explain about the title of the message. I don't usually make any reference to the title, but as I was preparing, and after the title had gotten locked in, I looked up in the phrase, "he's something else," in the Cambridge Dictionary, probably one of the most official guides to the English language, and the phrase, "he's something else," can mean, quote, unusual, extremely good, or extremely bad. As we are pointing to Jesus today, I feel it's necessary to make perfectly plain that Jesus is so unusual. He's one of a kind. And he's so extremely good. He's God. So, make no mistake, he's something else in a very good way. Let's look now at Revelation for a different kind of look and take on the character and nature and person of Jesus. We're going to pick it up in verse 14. Actually, let's go back to verse 12. Verse 12. I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw several golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, and with a golden sash around his chest. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp, double-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades." This is Jesus Christ our Lord. This is how he will appear to us on that day when he comes again. There's one other point that I wanted to be certain about. I wanted to be certain that with the title of the message, that no one thinks I'm applying to Jesus the hit song, "He's Something Else," made famous by the all-girl band, the Liverbirds. Do we have any Liverbird fans among us this morning? Really? Oh my goodness. The Liverbirds were an all-girl band from Liverpool, England, from 1963 to 1968. Now, it seems to me there was another band that came out of Liverpool in the 60s. Can't think of who they were, but they might have been as good as the Liverbirds. They take their name from a symbolic bird, a mythical creature representing their native city, Liverpool. In 2009, Irene Cara covered the song, changing the title to "My Baby." And I just want to be plain on the record today to say, Jesus has nothing to do with either of those songs. Okay? Just in case you were in your mind wondering. No, there's no connection there. So now that we've got all that settled, let me tell you what I do mean when I say Jesus is something else. We're continuing our look at Jesus here in Revelation, seeing him in a different light, emphasizing the divine side of his absolutely unique nature as God and man. We will all, along the way, be reminded that when he comes the second time, it will not be as a helpless peasant child as he did in the first advent. But in the second, he will come as all-conquering hero, the one who restores creation to its God-intended perfection, according to the plan of God the Father. This is the second in a series of 3 messages. You see in your message notes that we've already completed about a third of the information that's available to us in this passage. Today we'll tackle a few more as time allows. So under the heading New, we're going to start in verse 7, which we didn't read today, but you can go back and read for yourselves. It says there of Jesus that all the peoples of the earth will mourn because of him. What does that mean? All the peoples of the earth will mourn because of him. Here's what it means. Self-condemned people will be lost. I'll explain that, but just jot down, self-condemned people will be lost. In Revelation, there's a phrase, kind of a catchphrase that the writer John uses when he wants to describe people who are wicked, who are unbelieving, who reject Jesus Christ. And the phrase is, inhabitants of the earth. And he's referring here to people who are of the earth in the sense that they have not surrendered their life to Christ. They have not dealt with their sin nature. They indulge their human nature. They are anti-God in the way that they live. And so all of those kind of people are going to mourn, because when Jesus comes, they will be instantly aware of 2 things. One is that they made the worst mistake possible. They rejected Christ. And second, that it's too late. And what a horrible thing to have happen, and how we as Christians should cry out so that those we meet, those we know, those we love, will not suffer that fate. Then we go to verse 8, where Jesus declares of himself that he is the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, in verse 17. Whenever we see the words I am on the lips of Jesus, it reminds us of what Moses, or God said to Moses when he wanted to know him on a first name basis. God said, I am who I am. And the words I am are Yahweh in the Hebrew, or Jehovah in your King James Bible. And that is the definition of God. And so when Jesus uses those words for himself, he is saying, I am God. He says, I am Alpha, I am first, referring to his role in creation. And when Paul wrote to the Colossians, chapter 1, verse 16, he said and affirmed very clearly that nothing was created without Jesus Christ. That he is present in all things that are created. All that is created by him. So he is first in that sense of being the source of life. But he is also Omega. He is also last, because his second coming signals the end of this universe as we know it. This world, as we have come to understand and experience it, will come to a sharp end when Jesus comes again. It will be the ultimate urban renewal project as it is swept away and replaced by a new heaven and a new earth. Read Revelation 21. He says also in verse 8 that he is the Almighty. He has all power. Now this word is literally translated Lord of Hosts, or leader of the angels. And it shows that not only is Jesus creator, but he has power over his creation. And he doesn't use that power to negate the free will that he's given every one of us. He's delegated to us the authority to decide for ourselves, accept him and live, or reject him and perish. Instead, he relies on the guiding power of love, the persuasiveness of sacrifice. And so should we. Go to verse 13 now, where John, as he describes this vision of this figure standing among the lampstands, says that he is, quote, like a son of man. And this is a very rich term in the Bible. We don't really, I think, appreciate the diversity of how this term is used. We're familiar that Jesus in the Gospels chooses that as his own title and used it most frequently in reference to himself. But it actually originates in the prophecy of Ezekiel, where the prophet is referred to as the Son of Man. It appears again in Daniel, where there is a figure endowed with divine power who is like a son of man. And that's why it appears in quotation marks in the book of Revelation. This phrase is repeated in Revelation 14:14 as a description of an angel. So we have Jesus, we have Ezekiel, we have Daniel, we have an angel, and all of them are referred to as a son of man. What does it mean then? It means that this is a figure who has some human characteristics, but has been endowed with divine power. Someone who has the Holy Spirit and is able to speak and act out of the power of the Spirit. Also in verse 13, we're told that this Son of Man was dressed in a robe that went all the way down to his feet. And wearing a full-length robe in this culture was a sign of wealth or authority or both. And so that little detail shouldn't escape our notice. We should see, as John intended for the reader to see, that this Son of Man is not an ordinary Joe Schmo, but instead he is a figure of high authority. In fact, the additional detail of the gold sash across his chest is also meant to convey this authoritative nature. In the Old Testament, the high priest wore a gold breastplate that was adorned with 12 semi-precious stones, each one of them representing one of the tribes of Israel. And maybe the image is meant to remind us of that priesthood, for Jesus is referred to as our high priest. So that is part of it as well. In this culture, the gold sash is the equivalent of having a badge or an ID in our culture. It verifies that the person wearing it has authority. In Revelation 15, verse 6, the 7 angels who bear the 7 plagues wore gold sashes as well, for this same reason. So we have a figure of authority here. Go to verse 14, where the description now goes to his person. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow. White is a biblical symbol of purity, and the fact that his head is white, and it's mentioned twice, conveys a purity of intellect, of will, of emotion. This directly associates Jesus with the Ancient of Days in Daniel chapter 7, verse 9, who was described in very much the same way. Go to verse 14 now. His eyes were like a blazing fire. What does this mean? It means 3 words: he judgment. And the fact that his eyes are ablaze indicates that Jesus sees accurately and judges fairly. There's nothing that escapes his notice. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13, Paul wrote, "Nothing in all creation is hidden from his sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give an account." Go to verse 15. "His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace." Like bronze glowing in a furnace. In biblical times, the feet were the lowliest part, not just the lowest part, but the lowliest part of the human body. And to clean the feet of others was the job of the slave who was at the bottom of the household pecking order. To sit at someone's feet was a place for a learner, as we read in Luke chapter 10 with Mary. To be defeated was to be under someone's feet, as we see in Psalms 8. The prophet Ezekiel described 4 living creatures he saw in a vision, and one detail of those heavenly creatures is that their feet beamed like burnished bronze. In the Bible, bronze is a sacred metal. Many of the furnishings of the temple were made with bronze. And if we had time, we'd go to Numbers 21, and we'd see that when many Israelites were killed by poisonous snakes, God revived them when Moses held up a snake made of bronze. So bronze is a metal, a thing that is special to God. And so if this verse is saying to us that down to the lowliest part of who he is, Jesus Christ, is special, is divine, is powerful, we are to have a sense in our hearts that this is God and that Jesus is our divine hero. And again, glowing in a furnace, this is a biblical symbol of judgment. And so we add to this then 1 Corinthians 15:25, "For he must reign until he has put all his enemies" where? Under his feet. Under his feet. So this image is one of the conquering king, the one who comes and with divine power puts his enemies under his feet. Very quickly, look at verse 15. "His voice was like the sound of rushing waters." In Ezekiel 43, the prophet is given a vision of the glory of God. And in that vision, the voice of God is like the voice of rushing waters. Like a mighty waterfall, like a great cataract of water that commands attention. The voice of God roars. No one should mistake the message of God or his commands or his authority. This image says to us, sit up and take notice. What you're hearing is important. And then finally, in verse 16, in his right hand he held 7 what? Stars. 7 stars. Obviously, we're not talking movie stars here, but lights in the heavens. The right hand in the Bible is a symbol of authority. The king held the scepter in his right hand. Verse 20 tells us that the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. And so in that place of authority, Jesus holds the angels who minister to and are, in some sense, responsible for the 7 churches that are specifically named in chapters 2 and 3. Again, this is a symbol of authority. What we're learning, friends, is that only the Son of Man is powerful enough to save us. As we've been learning on Wednesday nights, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so while it is true that Jesus is the gentle shepherd, that it is true that Jesus is the great healer, it is also true that he is the conquering king. It is also true that he is the Lord of hosts. It is also true that when he appears again, it will be to conquer and to put away all evil for all time. He is a powerful and authoritative figure, not to be taken for granted, not to be messed around with. So we have an extra impetus to take seriously the claims of Jesus upon our lives. We have here an extra motive to look to the sky and to pray. Jesus, may it be today. May you come again. Until he does, we continue to learn, to grow, to love, and to seek him. Hymn number 596 is right away an example for us to put this teaching to work. I surrender all. Don't sing it if you don't mean it. Mean it in your heart. Sing it with the kind of joy, with the kind of intensity, with the kind of feeling that you would have if you were singing it to Jesus directly. Will you stand, please? 596.